Everybody there? All right, on this one, where he starts out at, we're in the Patriarch era. And so the first people that you should automatically think of is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the big three. And we know Jacob later becomes what? Israel. Israel has those 12 sons, and then we see the 12 tribes of Israel. And out of that, we see Joseph. And the crazy thing about Joseph, this is how you think, well, man, our families are all mixed up. These boys sold their brother into slavery. Now, how messed up is that? You're thinking, man, that's pretty messed up, to sell your own family off like that. They must have really, really hated this boy. But he winds up being the second in command in all of Egypt and actually helping his family to obtain the best land of that area. Now that right there is a really great story that took, what was that, about 20 plus years. It was right in there. It took a long time for that to just come to fruition. And what we see though is them boys meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. God worked that out to save a lot of lives. And so when things happen in your family, and this is for me too, we've got to understand that God is in control, and he could be working out something that could help a multitude of people. And so that, we can't see it. See, Joseph couldn't see all that when he was down in that pit. He couldn't see it when he was in prison, falsely accused of raping Potiphar's wife. I mean, he couldn't see the big picture, but when all of it kind of come down to it, and then all his brothers were in front of him, and they were having that feast, and he broke down crying because he was like, I'm your brother. It had been so long, they didn't even recognize him. Isn't that something? How God. So that's one of your patriarchs that we're going to look at tonight. Great story about Joseph. They even got VeggieTales versions of that, right? So if you hadn't ever seen it before and you're struggling with it, get the VeggieTales version. Does anybody know what VeggieTales is? Before your time? No? Okay. You know the VeggieTales? You know what the VeggieTales is? All right, so you've been around for a bit. All right, so page 47. It's the third paragraph, and I really like this. I want you to see this. It talks about how parenting and children can be difficult at times. It says, even the President of the United States was perplexed by the antics of his child, Alice Roosevelt. Now, guess who the president was? Theodore Roosevelt, right? So we see the daughter. I'm asking you these softball questions to see if you follow me, okay? And she was an unruly girl whose antics scandalized the staid Washington society during her father's tenure at the White House. And they were mad about it, and then they kept fussing at Roosevelt, and he gets down a little bit further and quote unquote says, I can be president of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both. So that was funny, because it kind of shows you how much work it takes to parent one child, especially one that's just wild as a buck, right? Tammy Jackson, right?
Yeah, you were on.
Right, yeah. Angela, right?
I got 3.
It's hard to keep hold of them, but anyway, it's a big thing. So that kind of gets us, that's an opening salvo into this. It says the Patriarch era was a time of godly men presiding over a growing family. We see Abraham, he kicks things off. And we see Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then next thing you know, we're sitting in Egypt, and guess how many people we got at the time of Egypt 400 years after this? Anybody? Want to take a stab at it? Round 2 or 3?
2 to 3.
2. It was. I knew I've heard 2 on several occasions, but then you get the women and children and all that. It could really be on up there. So yeah, I mean, 400 years. Yeah, now you've got a big old family out there, a big nation, the nation of Israel. Now, here he says they had successive generations, same family, ruled over the Hebrew people in the earliest days of existence. Now, that jogged my memory. Joan, you asked me a question, I think about a few months ago. You remember?
Mm-hmm.
No? She asked me, and I was like, I never thought about that. She said, did the Hebrews come first or was it the Jews? You remember that question? You think you remember? And I was like, well, I said, Abraham was the first Hebrew, the first Jew. So I said, I think it's one and the same. Well, researching it today, I said, it's bugging me. I got to find out, because I looked. I said, I don't know. As far as I know, he was the beginning of that nation. We call them Israelites. We call them Jews. They also call them Hebrews. We have the Hebrew Bible. Is the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. The New Testament's written in what language? Anybody? Original language. Greek and Aramaic. Some of it's Aramaic. Most of it's Greek. That's why when the guys go to the seminaries, they have to study the Greek and Hebrew for a couple semesters, and I'm just like, a couple semesters ain't gonna do it. I don't think. I mean, you'd have to really learn a language like that to be effective with it. All right, anyway, so let me give you a little bit. I'm going to take a side note here. Who are the Hebrews? This is coming off of the site. It just question of the day, and I could give you some reference if you really want to see it. The Hebrews are the people that descend from Abraham. But where did the word Hebrew come from? And one source is listed in Genesis chapter 10, verse 24, is they think that this isn't definite. They're thinking that this dude named Eber, E-B-E-R, was a ancestor, and he was like in the Hebrew. That's where they came up with the name Hebrew. So I was like, I could possibly see that. He's the great grandson of Shem, and so we see. Who's Shem? Does anybody remember Shem from the Genesis study? Noah's sons, Ham, Shem, Japheth. So we see Shem right there. And we see he's the ancestor here. Here's another possibility. The etymology traces the original root word back to the phrase from the other side. Now that's kind of, I'm like, oh, okay. So how like in the Indian culture, like Native Indian culture, it would be a person might be called Killing Bear because he killed a bear. It's something they did, right? Or it's something that they accomplished, and that was their nickname, or something like that. So this is kind of what I'm seeing here. The phrase is from the other side because he was designated as an immigrant. Now you remember he came from the land of Ur, and then he came back over into the land of Canaan, right? And then we see the whole family moving in back over to Egypt after the famine. That's the reason why they kind of headed that direction. They were like, hey, we got this land over here that's great. We're going to put everybody over there. And so the word, or it's designated as the immigrant, or he came over, so that's another possibility. Here's some other. Let's see. Terah was the father of Abraham. If you go back and study the lineage, you'll see Terah right before that. Over in Genesis 11, it gets in there. He had his brothers. And it becomes clear that if Hebrews were the descendants of Eber, I get it right, say, the others beside those of Abraham's line could also be included. So they could have been included as Hebrews also. But when we see God call him out as the beginning of that nation, that he was going to make them a great nation, we see the Jewish nation, the Israelites. So let me give you some more on, let me give you a little bit more on this. Today, Hebrew is usually thought of as a member of a group of ancient people who trace their lineage from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's almost like it's synonymous with Jewish and Israelite. They're kind of interchangeable, but there's more of from what I'm going to tell you next, the Hebrew part is more of a negative thing because the Egyptians said those Hebrew people are this, this, and this, and we've got to kill them to slow them down. So it was more like a negative thing, and I'll show you that here in a second through the scripture. We see here in, he's called the Hebrew, Genesis 14, 13, 400 years in Egypt, and they became this distinct people group. That's when the Pharaoh called them out in Exodus 1:19. He said that he called them the Hebrew nation. Anybody want to turn there right quick? You want to turn there and read that? Exodus 1:19.
All right.
Then the Philistines and Canaan, and we're going fast forward using the term Hebrews in 1 Samuel. Jonah identifies himself as a Hebrew in Jonah, chapter 1, verse 9. 100 years later, or hundreds of years later, I was like, man, that's off. But later on in the New Testament, Paul's still using the same identification in Philippians. So Hebrews is used a lot over there, and so it's like, all right, well, where does the Jewish thing come from, or who was the first Jew? It doesn't really occur until 2 Kings is when we see it, where the terminology. And now I've heard of, the capital being Jerusalem, and then we see Judah being that. I've heard of people saying that, and that brings that out too. So I'm going to let you kind of decipher it with me here. It doesn't occur till 2 Kings, the word Jew. It's also commonplace in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, because in Esther, they say it's the people of the Jews, and the word or the usage of it, we start to see the origin of it. Okay, so who was the first Jew? So this kind of bounces back and forth with Abraham and Judah. It depends on what is meant, or the definition of it here. He's talking about God's chosen people were known as Hebrew. Later they settled in the Promised Land, formed a nation. The Israelites, the term Jew didn't come until after the 10 northern tribes were exiled in Assyria, and Judah was exiled to Babylon. So that's where we see that introduction according to this, and then we got some Bible verses here too. So to answer your question, we see Hebrew first, and the terminology Jew a little bit later. And it makes sense with the shortening of Judah to say Jew. It's like an abbreviation almost. But the word Jew was used as a descriptor for more than just the tribe of Judah. It was the dominance of the tribe of Judah in return to the Promised Land, and they referred to all of them as Jews. And I was like, all right, that kind of makes sense a little bit.
Hebrew, I'm thinking back, the word Hebrew to like all the people in Canaan and stuff like that, you used that almost like a byword.
Like for a slang for a bad word, kind of.
And it was kind of like a slang, I guess you would call, because it was reference to the bearded men that kept sheep.
Oh, okay.
And they lived out under the stars. That's how.
So that was kind of their way of putting them down. It was like.
Yeah, and so that kind of stuck with them, I think, is what I'm trying to say. How that really term came around was you Hebrew.
That's the kind of what I picked up on in Exodus.
So it was derogatory?
Well, the Pharaoh and the Egyptians didn't like them because they were slaves. They put them in slavery. And so then they killed, they started killing off the young boys. And then we see Moses. And so, man, in other words, they didn't like them very
they were
much.
unclean.
Right.
They considered them unclean. That's reading that you see the Egyptians shaved every hair on their body and for cleanness and stuff.
And see, that shaving was not a good thing. That's what they would do to the enemy. They would shave their beard, and that was like a bad put down for the men. But here, so who was the first Jew? We mean Hebrew. If we're meaning Hebrew, Abraham was the first Jew because God called him out, right? But if by Jew we mean of the tribe of Judah, Judah was the first Jew. But really, when we see him come, when God comes out and says, hey, I'm going to make you a nation, a people that you can't count, that's all of it's pointing to Abraham, right? I mean, doesn't that make sense? And so we see here, but Judah, I mean, it sounds good, and I'm just like, yeah, but it just doesn't fit. You know, it's kind of like, well, yeah, it sounds, phonetically it sounds right, but physically and textually and in context, it really doesn't fit. Because we see Abraham being called out, specially called out to guide and to be the patriarch of these people. So it just all points to that, right? So it's a good question. I mean, I was like, well, you know what? I hadn't really ever went that direction on finding that out. So that was a good study for me too.
Did you want me to read that verse?
Yeah, go ahead. I forgot to ask you. I'm sorry. I get on a roll sometimes.
So Exodus 1:12.
I almost thought you said eczema.
Exodus 1:12.
Like the little kid on the video, he's like, I got some eczema.
I got what?
Go ahead.
I did not say that. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel.
Okay. Doesn't say the Hebrews.
It does on down, but you didn't.
Oh, well, keep reading. I thought that was the verse he said, he talked about the Hebrew nation.
And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter and hard in bondage, in mortar, and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of
See, you're reading she's reading the old King James 119. Read 119 again.
Oh, wait a minute, I already way up, sorry.
See, Brother Tom?
Okay, it says, and the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them.
Yeah, see, really, the midwives was kind of, you know, they were tougher women, but they was also protecting them children is what they was doing. Y'all, if y'all read the stories, anybody ever read that story in full, not just getting the Sunday school version? When you read it in detail and you just try to visualize that these people are protecting these boys from being murdered. And anyway.
That they're lively. The Hebrew women are lively.
Yeah.
It means they don't.
Well, they were saying that, you know, they can have a baby out in the field and go back to work.
Lively means that they would work up to the minute time to deliver. They walk over yonder and squat to have a baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a woman, is all I'm gonna tell you.
That
That's not Tammy Jackson.
Well.
I need that epidural. I need that epidural right now.
Still do that?
There's a lot of women that still do it. There's women in the United States that choose to do that. For whatever reason, you crazy. Give me the medicine and let me wrong.
Well, anyway, now go to page 48, and we're going to look there. We're going to go back to our chart, and if you did your homework, you had your chart filled out, and you better answer these real quick. All right, so in the era of creation, who was the main figure?
Adam.
What was the location? All right, Adam's created by, y'all see where I'm at in the chart? Adam is created by God, but he sinned and destroyed God's original plan for man. He messed things up, right? All right, so then we go into, now we're in the page. You see, you're going to see this repetition, but by the end of the study, hopefully it'll stick with you and you'll be like, well, hey, I think that was in that era with the patriarchs, right? That was in the creation. So it's going to make sense when you start seeing that repetition pay off, okay? Now, the patriarch is this era that we're in now. Who's the main figure of the patriarch era? Abraham, and we see Isaac, Jacob, which becomes Israel, and then we see Joseph out of that, all right? All right, now, it's kind of interesting, though, that the first time I read through, and I was like, well, you know, Jesus is through the bloodline of what? Judah. He's the line of the tribe of Judah. But yet Joseph is the one who ended up, you know, running things and getting everything situated. But Judah, he was in that storyline too. But yet we don't see, we see a little bit later on when Judah gets strong, how that's, you're like, well, hey, yeah, it makes sense that they're called the line of Judah, because they were always one of the stronger tribes, right? And when you get to studying, you had the 10 northern tribes, those were those 10 brothers, and then you had the 2 southern tribes. You know, at one point during, you had David and then Solomon's reign, they were together. And after Solomon's reign, we see that split, right? Does everybody remember that? You got the 10 and the 2. But Judah, and who was the other one? I'm just trying to check to see if y'all know who was the other one in the southern. Benjamin. Benjamin was who out of the 12 brothers?
He was the leader.
He was the baby boy. He was the baby boy, right? And man, they loved him. Why did they love Benjamin so much? Not just because he was the last one. Because of his mama.
Yeah, that's
right? And who was his mama? I'm drilling you now. I'm trying to get you so.
Is it Rebecca?
Rebecca. You have Rebecca and Leah. Remember that?
I
See, he loved Rebecca.
That's Isaac's wife.
And so when you see that baby boy, and they thinking the other boy's dead, they thought Joseph was dead for years, and they sent Benjamin. They're like, oh man, it broke their heart when they sent Benjamin off to Egypt.
Yeah.
But come to find out, big family reunion, they got everything back, moved into the best part of that land. God worked it out. All right. Anyway, and I know I kind of went around that, but I want you to see that on the surface, it's a good story, but when you get in deeper, it's a whole lot better. It's a whole lot more meat to it than just, you know, Joseph went in, and then Moses came out, brought him out. You know, that's kind of dry. But when you get into the details, and you're just like, man, these are people just like us. You know, struggling, waiting on God, trying to figure out what to do next. Trying to be faithful to God, and then God, you know, shows up and reveals him. Well, he's there the whole time, but he really shows and reveals himself in a lot of ways through that story. All right, anyway, you got Patriarch, Abraham. What's the location? Canaan, the land of Canaan. Where did Abraham start off at when he was younger, before God called him? U.R. It was in the land of the Chaldeans. All right, some say Chaldeans. Chaldean. I like the Chaldeans. The H is silent. I've heard it both ways, but his daddy was what? What was his name? Terah? What did he do for a living? Anybody?
Cigarettes?
No, he didn't do cigarettes. He made idols.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. He made idol. They were all into idol worship, and God called Abraham out of that. I'm telling you, God uses who he wants to use, and he did this one in a mighty way. And it just goes to show you, it's like, man, he can use anybody he wants to. It's kind of an amazing thing to see that. But now Abraham, you know, he had his part too, following after God in a lot of different situations. All right, so the era is the patriarch. Abraham is chosen by God to be the father of a people, to represent God to the world. Now that's a big job right there. Being able to be that one to represent God to the world. And they fall short on a lot of different areas, right? It's because we're sinful people. All of us, by the way, are sinners, right? Okay. We all make mistakes. All right, now going to the self-test. Go to page 50, and we got the chart, and we got the map. All right, major men in there, and you got this little, have y'all done that part? You got Jacob, and he is the father of the nation of Israel. Joseph, He's the leader in Egypt. Abraham is what? Father of the Hebrew people. There we see the Hebrew again, right? That's the common thing for him at this point. Isaac is the second father of promise, or the second in the line of the patriarchs. Now, Isaac, he had a good story too. There were some things happening there too with him. But boy, it gets crazy with Jacob. Him and Esau, and then all that went on, and all the brothers, and oh man, the more people you got, the more problems you got, right? That's what we see. And so there's no surprise, we got 300 plus million people in this country, and we got a whole lot of problems. That's no big surprise when they had 12 and were selling their brothers into slavery. Now you think about that for a minute. And they had 2 million, and then and God sending all those plagues on Egypt, gets them out of there, and it was only 2 to 3 million. And here we are with 300 plus million, and we got tons of problems, right? Every little community, it seems like we got problems. All right, so what really makes a difference is what you do, right? What you do, what God does, but what you do, and how you respond, and how you can help others. Now, go to page 51, and you remember several chapters back, we see the state of Texas. It was the whole promised land in the size of the state of Texas. And we see here, you see where is? He wasn't too far from the Garden of Eden, where that was located in the earlier chapters, where it was, right in those, between the two rivers. But we know after the flood, things changed a lot. Geographical things changed, but we know after that, this is how it was. And then we see Canaan, right there to the left or west of that. Remember, it's right above the Dead Sea. You got, what's right above the Dead Sea?
The Sea of Galilee?
No, right in between. See, you think of it like a baseball bat. You got the Dead Sea is what's the big part of the bat?
Dead Sea.
No, what's the big part of the bat?
Got the Dead Sea in the river.
No, it's the big part of the bat.
The part you hit with.
The part you hit with, the part they cork all the time, right? And then the narrow part is like the Jordan River, and then that ball where your hand don't slip on, that's Sea of Galilee. Think of it like a baseball bat. You'll never forget it.
Why was you asking that question?
Yeah.
Well, I was asking what?
What?
No, I'm just saying, look at it. It looks like a little baseball bat.
Okay, so what's at the big end? The Dead Sea, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we said.
I know, but I was trying to ask you, what is it called on the bat? The trunk? I think the trunk's the narrow part.
It's called a bat.
The bat.
It's called a bat.
I said the part that they cork all the time when you get caught,
Is she giving out cupcakes yet?
Oh, yeah.
I need to go to children's class.
All right, so we got to hurry up now. The cupcakes done been released. Release the cupcakes instead of release the Kraken. All right, so then you see Egypt. Everybody see Egypt? So there's two little around going different places. So we see that all this stuff's right in this area. All right, and so, what, has anybody got a guess? That's gonna wrap us up, but does anybody have a guess on why God decided to do it in the size of Texas? The whole shooting match right there in the size of Texas.
Just how big it was.
You decided to do what? Where?
Why, now that we kind of know the geography of it, why do you think, I'm just saying just guess, why would you
To
speculate?
give us a visual of like the miles between.
Well,
Did they
yeah.
have travel and stuff?
The traveling, they didn't have the stuff we got today, so it's the travel. All right, but looking at the Patriarch chapter, and you see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we see this people that God has created, and he's going to make them the Hebrew people, he's going to make them the Israelites, he's going to make them a great nation, but he does it in this real tight area, and my first thought was so that everybody can see them. So that they can be, just like it said in that last part, in that last piece, to represent God to the world. And how do you do that if you're all over the world? Well, you're in that tight little area, you're representing God, to the Canaanites, to the Philistines, to the Egyptian. He kind of went that direction, and then come to find out, they kind of come on back around this other way. And so it's just kind of neat to see that, the geography. And that's one of the reasons how we can understand the Bible, and that's maybe another little piece of the puzzle that will help you to see it. It's like, wow, God did do that like that, and brought it. And then Jesus here, he comes on the scene, and you study the Gospels, and he's mainly in Capernaum, the Sea of Galilee, he's down to the Jordan, and he's up in Israel. He's in an even tighter little area, and everybody's coming to him, and he's going around those different areas to minister to people. But yeah, it's pretty cool to see that.